And before we begin this episode, just quickly, is it time for your business to evolve? Yes, it is. So come see Ninja Software, njs.dev. All right, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to another episode of Tech Society with your hosts, tech entrepreneurs and software pioneers, John Newham and Alex Dunmo.
Hey there, techies. You're listening to another episode of Tech Society. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're speaking with Stephen Shepherd, an experienced economist who has made a very successful career out of advising large private companies and government on a diverse range of economic and marketing analysis. In this episode, you'll learn what actually is an economist and what do they do in this day and age? How much has COVID actually affected the Australian economy? For example, Australia has actually gone into a recession for the first time in 30 years. And what is the economic impact of JobKeeper and what will happen when it goes? How big is the loss of revenue for the Australian economy when it comes to international students? And how can Australia bounce back with the right messaging thanks to the reputation we've built during the pandemic? All that and more in this episode, so keep listening. And don't worry, I realize speaking to an economist may sound boring, but this episode is anything but, so keep listening.
Okay. Stephen Shepherd, I'm currently working within my own economic consulting firm, and I've done that a couple of times. I've got, nearly 40 years experience in economics, and I've worked like Federal Treasury. I was chief economist at Census, which you probably know better as Yellow Pages, White Pages. I was chief economist there for about 11 years. I was senior economist at Grant Thornton, one of the really big accounting firms, for a couple of years. I was Director of Policy and Research at the Victorian Employers Chamber of Commerce for about 10 years.
Wow.
So, I've had a lot of experience. But basically, in the context of economics, there's basically two branches. One's basic to do with economic analysis and forecasting, what's going to happen to the exchange rate or something. I did that. That's how I started my career. The first 5 years I worked in an investments environment, advising investment dealers about all kinds, everything to do with economics. And then the other branch of economics is government policy. So, what should government do with the capital gains tax, or should there be further reforms to the goods and services tax, consumption model, etc. So I've worked in both major branches of economics. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's quite a history.
Yeah, I know. I've been around too long. I know.
So quite a lot of the time in our interviews and even our own, like just when John and I chat, one of the things we often say is, I don't know, I'm not an economist.
Yes.
Right. Not all economists know everything, I can assure you. So I may have to use that excuse from time to time.
So what does an economist do in a general sense, for the layman?
Yeah, okay. Well, as I said, if you're working in the private sector, it's more trying to work out what the current trends in the economy will mean for that business, and obviously also for the broader industry or the market that firm works in. For example, as a consultant, I've done work for I won't mention the companies, but for major manufacturers in the fishing equipment sector and also the bicycle sector. So I've looked at trying to connect a lot of the broader economic, retail, marketing, consumer survey data to give them a more holistic view of what's actually happening in the industry. Mm-hmm. And on my background is what's called macroeconomics, which basically means you start from the big picture. So you basically look at the national economy, what's going on there, and you drill it down to different industries and markets to work out how the broader economic trends, like what's happening with wages and retail sales and private consumption expenditure and savings ratios and these things, are likely to impact on individual markets, industries and firms. So I've done a lot of research sort of in that space. So within the private sector, that's probably the major area that economists work in. And obviously in the government sector, it's more about, the government will make a change in government policy, predominantly things like taxation or the size of the deficit, etc. And what are the implications, not only for the government, but also for the broader economy as a result of those changes. So they're the sort of two major branches of economics that most economists work in.
What are your observations for our current position in a national sense?
Well, I'm not sure, this doesn't get a lot of coverage from time to time, but I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Australian economy actually, as of the last quarter, or the major June quarter, Australia entered into a recession. And recession, economists have redefined what a definition of a recession is about 2 or 3 times in the last few decades. But basically, within the Australian context, a recession is defined 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And we had that in the June quarter. We had negative growth in March of last year, minus 0.3, and then we had minus 7.0% in June, and that was because of COVID. So Australia's actually gone technically into recession. That's the first recession Australia has been in for 30 years.
Wow.
So it's not something that gets a lot of attention in the media, which I find interesting, but technically we went into recession. And also what's very different from this recession to most other recessions is that there's usually one major factor for the recession, like we've had really high interest rates, and that's driven down consumption expenditure or something. And that's the reason why the 2 quarters have consecutively gone into negative GDP growth. But this time round, it's different. So this is very unusual because the March quarter wasn't affected by COVID, whereas June quarter clearly was. Our March quarter was affected by lower consumption, constrained retail sales. Also, we had the effects of the drought, particularly in terms of agricultural production, particularly states like New South Wales, which were dramatically affected by the drought. So that curtailed agricultural production. So a combination of a whole range of factors resulted in the March quarter being a negative. And then because COVID hit so dramatically, the Australian economy, and in particular the Victorian economy, the national economy went into a second consecutive quarter of negative GDP growth, which technically means Australia went into a recession as of the June quarter of last year.
Wow.
September, we actually bounced back. So there has been a recovery. So that's positive. Yeah.
Do you think like JobKeeper and JobSeeker had a big hand to play in that bounce back?
Yes, they have. And I noticed one of the commentators said the Australian economy is currently being held together by duct tape, which we refer to as either JobKeeper or JobSeeker. So it's not a very durable solution, I guess, in that sense, if you believe it's nothing more than duct tape. But certainly they've played a significant role. And I remember, and I've looked at some comparisons we can talk about at some stage about what happened with GFC. GFC was a huge impact on the global economy and what it meant and Australian government response, etc. And I've looked at some comparisons with what's happening with COVID. So there have been some significant factors in our history which have resulted in some significant declines, but COVID nevertheless has had a very significant impact on the economy. But the economy, not only the Australian economy, but also the US and the UK and other industrialised economies have bounced back pretty quickly because the government's effectively acknowledged that we need an immediate sort of stimulatory response to offset the weakness of COVID on the economy. And that's certainly been working. And I think the attitude of the government has been the right one. Yep.
Do you think they will cut it in March, or do you foresee them extending it further?
Well, the fact that the GDP in September quarter grew 3.3%, so bounced back pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I think they actually will look at curtailing a lot of those job seeker type arrangements as at the end of March, which is currently scheduled. And the unemployment rate, is held reasonably consistent. There obviously has been an increase, but we haven't gone to significant double-digit unemployment rates, etc. So I think because of those sorts of factors, I could see the government curtailing quite a lot of those payments, and I think the Australian economy will get through. Now, but the question is, I've been having a nightmare of a day myself because we've just gone into the 3rd stage lockdown in Victoria a couple of hours ago. So that comes into effect at 11:59 p.m. tonight, and we've gone into stage 4 lockdown. Again. Yeah, tell us about it.
We're just coming out of ours, so...
Yeah, someone like myself, if you just entered a new relationship, this makes a new relationship extremely difficult, I can assure you, because they live further than 5 kilometres from my house. And so, we've gone into really full-on stringent stage 4 lockdown provisions for 5 days. Now, the question is, when we went into stage 2 lockdown provisions, which lasted longer than 3 months, we had an expectation that would only be for a couple of weeks. Yeah. So, at the moment, our expectation is this will be 5 days, but what happens if there's another outbreak somewhere and then another one, and then, how long will it go? So with this environment, you just can't be certain about anything.
Isn't that where the national policy, like JobKeeper, JobSeeker, kind of falls through? Because even though nationally, say we might be doing well, some states might be in lockdown, like WA was just in lockdown, and now Victoria's in lockdown. So these businesses it's meant to protect are now kind of left out in the cold, right?
Yeah. Well, I actually I've got the figures in front of me just in terms of what's happened with the state economies. And then obviously you mentioned Western Australia. We'll compare New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia. In the September quarter of last year, New South Wales recorded growth of 6.8%, Western Australia 4.9%, and Victoria was minus 1%. So a slight contrast. And that just showed you how significant the stage 2 lockdown provisions, which we enacted pretty much through that quarter, you can see the impact it had, particularly on things like private consumption expenditure, etc., which was really, it fell by about 10%, I think. So, yeah, that had a dramatic effect. So it all depends on, how quickly the various COVID-19 response approaches really kick in, because the economy will really respond to what's happening in terms of the current state of the health of the nation. So, yeah.
With JobKeeper and JobSeeker, coming to a close within the next year or so, or next few months even, these companies that have, let's say, taken it and actually didn't qualify for it, do you think they'll be caught out? Do you think there'll be a government response to that?
Well, when the government announced, particularly with the JobKeeper program, which is effectively a subsidy to try and keep, production and service delivery going, is that basically what they did is that you had to provide evidence. So it wasn't necessarily a case of what industry sector. So obviously some industries like retail, hospitality, entertainment are going to be more impacted by the impacts of COVID than others. But rather than going down the industry-wide path, what they did is they just introduced a simple business turnover test. And that was, if you've had more than a loss of 30% or more of your business turnover on an annual basis, then effectively you are eligible to access the JobKeeper payment program, which is, about $1,500 per fortnight for each employee. So that's the way they've done it. So I guess any company that's tried to milk the books or whatever to try and provide a case that they've turnovers fallen by 30% when in fact it hasn't, well, there is the potential that obviously eventually they'll get audited and they may have to repay some of those funds. But yeah, so that was the initial test. So as long as companies have been able to provide evidence that at certain points because of COVID that they've lost more than 30% of their business turnover, then they're eligible for that form of JobKeeper payment. Yep.
On to JobSeeker, we found that I've seen a few parallels between JobSeeker and Universal Basic Income, or UBI. How accurate are these parallels?
Well, I guess what you're trying to do with JobSeeker, you're actually trying to provide a sort of ongoing level of income support to average households. So it's got, obviously there's a corollary there by providing that sort of ongoing income support, and that's been its objective. And to be honest, in terms of looking at what's happened to, I guess, the ultimate outcome of income is either going to be transmitted into private consumption expenditure or savings. Initially, some of those funds were channeled into savings because obviously we've had an environment where there's been a high level of demand and interest in housing because of extremely low interest rates. And to be honest, there's a potential percentage or a potential leakage of those funds into sort of things like housing demand, etc. But the reality is, in this environment, the overwhelming majority of funds clearly have gone into private consumption expenditure, which has helped to continue to underpin the economy. And particularly when you look at the national economy, which recorded growth of 3.25%, in the September quarter, private consumption expenditure bounced back dramatically, and really those JobSeeker payments were pivotal to underpinning that trend. Yeah.
Do you think the JobKeeper program will slowly be reduced post-March, or will it be a sudden cut-off?
Well, to be honest, I think that if I was advising the government, the solution would really be dependent on what does the economy really seriously look like at the end of March. And also, obviously, how well are we going, but in terms of really offsetting the effects of COVID? And at this stage, Australia is virtually, in some ways, virtually a world leader in terms of ameliorating the effects of COVID. So I would imagine if those factors continue, I would imagine that the potentially governments could look at phasing out some of those support mechanisms pretty quickly, as long as there wasn't another massive kick-up. And look, in this environment, you just can't say, you can't be certain about anything, because there could be another, this so-called British virulent
strain,
yeah, that's right, strain that just appeared on this from nowhere. That could all of a sudden take off, and then the government may have to go into lockdown mode in terms of really trying to provide strong support to the economy again. So but assuming that doesn't happen and things just continue to manage as well as they have been on in a general sense, then you wouldn't expect to see continued significant support much beyond the next month or two. Yeah.
Does this instability make it a great time to be an economist?
Well, probably, but it also is not a good time for businesses, because one of the sort of what economists often refer to as the engine of long-term economic growth is business investment. And the only way people make a long-term, because business investment is dependent upon making decisions about the return on investment you're going to get from funds if you invest those funds over the next 5 or 10 years. And in order to make those sorts of decisions, you need certainty. And in this environment, with a lack of certainty, this is clearly starting to have an impact on business investment. So that's a potentially negative in terms of the sort of more medium-term economic projections for the economy. If businesses don't continue to invest for the longer term because of the level of uncertainty, that could potentially act as a constraint on Australia's longer-term economic growth. But I guess we just wait and see what will happen. But yeah, certainly, I guess, in this environment, there's a lot of focus on economics, economists and economic solutions. But I went through GFC, when GFC hit, everyone wanted to talk to an economist because no one could work out what was going on and what's this thing called global financial crisis and what's prime lending all about, etc. So, but to be honest, I've worked in long-term economic forecasting my whole life, and clearly I don't match up to someone like Bill Gates, because the issue of a global pandemic of this magnitude was something that I never really ever seriously considered, but obviously it was very much a potential. Yeah.
I think one of the issues to the Australian economy, at least from my perspective, is a lot of the big retail and entertainment avenues that people spend that money is now all overseas. Netflix, Amazon. You've got these Google, you've got these big companies that are, if they're not taking all the money, they're at least taking a pretty substantial clip of the ticket. Does this have a negative impact on our economy versus GFC, which I think, retail was far more local?
Yeah. Well, I guess when you look at the sort of purchase by Australian consumers, if you like, of imported services versus exported services, you're absolutely spot on. So when you look at entertainment, etc., we're obviously a net importer because of Netflix and HBO and those sorts of services relative to the sorts of services we export in that space. But in other areas, in services, we're a strong export provider, like education, like the number of students who study in Australia from overseas. So that's a sort of export service which effectively goes the other way. So we're actually a beneficiary. But you're right, in terms of hospitality and entertainment and some of those things, we're a net importer. So that's actually a drain on Australia's balance of trade situation. And it is a negative for the economy in that sense, yeah.
With the international students, I think that's heavily been affected by COVID. Will that have an impact on the greater economy as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It will. There's going to be a significant loss of revenue to Australian education institutions. And you see that a lot of the major education institutions in Australia have had to start to downsize, and they're doing all kinds of things of looking at how they can offset the loss of revenue from overseas students. So I'd imagine those trends are going to stay for a while. But obviously once things settle down, then I could see it bouncing back really quickly. And the positive for Australia, if the perspective of the international marketplace is that we've probably managed COVID virtually better than anywhere else, that's going to be a net positive for the Australian educational sector, because people think, well, the potential risks associated with the pandemic are going to be significantly less than in Australia than what they are overseas. And just on that score, I've been reading articles about a number of sort of like Hollywood actors, etc., that have been effectively been migrating to Australia in this environment because, in the United States, when you're getting 100,000 cases a day and no one seems to be too perturbed by that. In Australia the other day, we had, 0 for the whole country. That's a dramatic difference.
What about the Asian countries? So Australia is very reliant on China, and there's been a bit of back and forth lately. China itself has been doing reasonably well in terms of COVID, but it's hard to tell from here. What about their economy? Do you have any words on that?
Yeah, look, their economy is still obviously extremely strong. It's still recording very strong growth. It was only about 6 or 7 years ago, China overtook Japan. This is the second largest economy in the world. And current estimates appear like in the next decade or so, there is a potential that China could overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Wow. So, the underlying growth rate is around about 7% in China. And in the US, it's virtually like 3%. So that 4 percentage points differential just keeps going every year. Yeah, that eventually China will overtake the US as the world's largest economy. But it's quite, amazing when you think of where China has come from and the pace of growth it's been able to record. It's been an amazing transformation in the last few decades, and I think that trend will continue. Well, I must admit, I'm a typical cynical Australian economist, but some of the figures that come out of China, there is some degree of credibility attached to those figures, but nevertheless, the underlying strength of the economy, because I tend to rely on OECD numbers, etc., and they're going to at least be credible. But those numbers certainly continue to suggest that sort of growth. But the big issue, of course, China is more going to be on the political level because they're trying to position themselves in terms of their percentage of world trade and etc., and what they've done in terms of playing around with their currencies and all kinds of things. What will happen there, and there's already seen significant political dynamics between China and the Morrison government, and I think it's already starting to happen with the Biden administration. So China has a goal of about how significant a player it's going to be on the world market. And of course, the other issues are, the internal political issues within China about, what will ultimately happen with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Will China continue to let Taiwan do its own thing? Yeah, so they're going to be real challenges that the world will have to take note of.
Before we continue this podcast, here's a message from our sponsor.
We believe that you can create art and beauty with technology. We think big. We move quietly. We are Ninja Software.
With cryptocurrencies, do you think they could actually be used as a currency? Or does that, not having the ability to add more money to the system kind of create too little volume or too little velocity?
Yeah, well, there's the potential for cryptocurrencies to add to the rate of inflation because of the issues you're talking about, the velocity of money in the system. So that, in its sense, so if it really just continues to accelerate, could actually rekindle, to a certain extent, only a marginal extent, but could rekindle inflation. So that's a potential issue and concern. And I guess cryptocurrency becomes, to me, really important once you start to see it an important instrument of actual tradable, when people start exchanging actual tradable assets across borders, etc., and they're using cryptocurrency as the foremost vehicle to do that. So at the moment, cryptocurrencies represent only a small percentage of total traded, if inverted commas, currencies. If that became a really significant component of total value of tradable currencies, I just think that's a very interesting scenario for the world economy.
One of the whole things about the cryptocurrency movement is that no one can inject more into the closed economy.
No central bank,
no reserve. Everything's controlled, and people fight against that because then the government won't be able to help the economy when COVID-19 hits and all that, because it's the supply is locked. So it's one of those things where, I don't know, is it a good thing or a bad thing? What are your
Well,
thoughts?
in that sense, because I guess at the end of the day, what governments want, particularly when you're fighting a major exogenous shock, which is what economists often refer to with things like COVID-19,
Yeah.
a major shock to the economy, what you want is as many policy instruments as possible
Yeah.
to effectively fight it. So you want fiscal policy, you want monetary policy, you want trade policy, you want wages policy. The more policy instruments you've got, you can throw it at it and have a bigger economic impact. But if you've got a situation where cryptocurrency starts to undermine the autonomy and independence of individual central banks, then that becomes a constraint on the ability of governments to actually manage their own economy. And that's been an issue with, exchange rates for a long period of time. We saw the whole thing with Brexit, etc. But what was interesting is that one of the things that Britain never, ever did, they never gave their currency away. They kept the British pound. They never joined the euro. And that always gave them just that degree of greater autonomy over the management of the British economy. Obviously, once you give that away, you lose that control and that autonomy, and you can no longer even influence your own exchange rate policy to potentially impact the performance of your own economy. And many economists, and I know I'm one of them, that's argued that particularly in Europe, that if countries like Italy had kept and Greece had kept the lira and the drachma and these sorts of things, when those economies were being crunched, they would have actually been able to significantly impact the performance of their own economies by devaluing their currencies to offset the impacts from GFC and a whole range of other things and the impact of the European marketplace. But the fact that they lost their control and their sovereignty over their own exchange rates means that they lost a major policy instrument to control the future of their own respective economies. So that can be an issue, sure.
Do you think that retail investors are disadvantaged compared to like the funds you would have worked for and the big players?
Yeah, I think it obviously because of the level of resourcing, their access to markets, the networks that they have, etc. Yeah, there probably are some disadvantages. There's sort of an asymmetrical way the market operates in that sense. But then you have organisations like the ACCC that's supposed to ensure open, fair market competition that applies to all the major participants and players. So that's what's trying to happen. And obviously, if people exceed the sort of underlying fair principle, market principles, which is set down by groups like ACCC and their legislation, well, there's consequences for doing that. But the reality is that bigger, stronger, faster players will have access to networks that other potential players don't have, and that will give them an information gain that they can use to their advantage. Sure, yeah.
Just one last question that I should have asked you earlier, so my apologies for that. But with the JobKeeper and JobSeeker ending, do you think that, let's say you're a business who didn't use that, didn't need it, but you are competing with your competition who have this, were able to put this subsidy in place, and maybe that's making it that a little bit difficult for you. But do you think that there'll be quite a few businesses that go out of business after these subsidies end
Because they're too reliant on
that were artificially propped up and probably weren't making it in the first place? Do you think that will have a substantial impact on commerce and the local economy?
Yeah. Look, because of those inconsistencies and irregularities, there will nevertheless be impacts. But I guess if you had to say which industry sectors, it's, I guess, the industries which have been most affected by COVID, so hospitality, entertainment, parts of retail, etc., tourism, obviously, those are the sectors where potentially the sort of potential shakeout that you're talking about and the differentials that have occurred between different industry players, they're more likely to be the most significant because they're the industries which have faced the greater degree of volatility. So I'd imagine if there is going to be some potential relative shakeout, they're the industries you're going to see most of it occurring. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. All right. That was really, really interesting. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So there's one last question we always ask.
Right.
It's a whimsical question. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
I don't know how familiar you are with wrestling or boxing, UFC. Yeah. When the fighters come out, the lights go down, the smoke machine starts, and the fighters' introduction music comes on. What is your intro music?
That's a really interesting question. For some bizarre reason, in terms of I really liked hard rock and heavy metal bands, etc., I'd probably run with the Rain Song by Led Zeppelin.
Beautiful.
Oh, awesome.
That's a great choice. Yeah, excellent. Right. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Was fascinating.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was good.
You've made it to the end of another episode of Tech Society. And on this week in tech history, February 26th, 1991, the first web browser is introduced. Tim Berners-Lee introduces the World Wide Web, the first web browser, and what you see is what you get HTML editor. Make sure you hit us up on Twitter @TechSociety, head over to the website, subscribe to the newsletter. Have a great weekend, everybody.